Hello ladies and gentlemen, and once again welcome to The Fyrdsman. This is going to be the first installment in a new series on Anglo-Saxon paganism that we're starting here on the Fyrdsman channel. In this series we're going to be taking a deeper look at who the Anglo-Saxon pagan deities were, how the Anglo-Saxons worshipped, what sort of festivals they would have attended, and how they viewed the world around them. Now I find it quite unfortunate that Anglo-Saxon paganism is so often overshadowed by its more flashy cousin, Norse paganism. There's nothing wrong with Norse paganism, it's interesting in its own right, but I prefer Anglo-Saxon stuff. There is also a tendency to think that Anglo-Saxon paganism is just Norse paganism, but with funny English-sounding names. Now, over the next few videos, I want to prove to you guys that that is not the case, that Anglo-Saxon paganism has a distinctive culture and flavour all of its own. Now, I get it, Norse paganism is interesting, the tales are great, the sagas are wonderful, the poetry is spectacular. However, I believe that there is a real and tangible value in English people learning their own history and not just trying to LARP as Norwegians or Danes. However, if you are not English and you're still watching this, please don't disappear just yet. I love teaching Anglo-Saxon history to literally anyone who will listen. Your nationality is not a prerequisite for being interested in this period of history. So what is this video going to be about then? First things first, this is going to be an introductory video. I'm not going to cover everything in this single video. That would take far too long and I'll get complaints. And I don't like complaints. In this video, we are going to cover three main points. The first, what actually is paganism as a belief system? The second, we're going to be taking a look at some Anglo-Saxon deities. I say some, we're not going to be doing all of them because there are a lot and that deserves its own separate video. And finally, we're going to be taking a look at how the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon peoples worshipped their gods and goddesses. So without further ado, let's begin. So what is paganism? Well, the word pagan comes from the Latin root word paganus, which means something along the lines of rural or rustic. However, as early as the 4th century, the term pagan was used as a pejorative by early Christians, alongside words such as Helena, Gentile, and heathen. In the time of the Roman Empire, people were referred to as pagans as they were increasingly less cosmopolitan and less city-oriented than their Christian counterparts. They were also called pagan if they were not the milites Christi, the soldiers of Christ, if they did not follow the teachings of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Now, during the Middle Ages, the term paganism began to be associated with any religion that was not Christian, and it was usually used to denote a belief in false gods. The term pagan then is mostly a Christian invention, used to distinguish between those who follow the one true God and those who don't. Now, it was not until the early 20th century that people began to use the term pagan as a self-descriptor. Now, this ties in with the revival of neo-pagan religions across the globe. Now, the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon people would not have referred to themselves as pagan. Their concept of religion was not like that which we have today. Now, the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons had no written discourse upon religious or ritual matters. Their beliefs and their traditions were passed down through the generations via word of mouth, through an oral tradition. This means that stories, myths, legends and beliefs were passed down from one generation to the next. Now, whilst there are tips, tricks and memory techniques that one can use to memorize a huge amount of information that has been given to you through word of mouth, this means that stories did not always stay the same from one generation to the next. For instance, my grandfather tells my father a story. My father remembers the key details, but he forgets some of the little details along the way. When I grow up, he tells me the same story, but uses his details instead of the ones that my grandfather had given to him. Obviously, there are ways in which stories would be remembered. However, the point is that little details can change over time. This means that paganism was a fluid, living religion with little in the way of an organized system of beliefs. Sure, we have our old traditions, we have our old stories, but they are subject to small changes over time. This isn't a bad thing. The Norse sagas were passed down for generations before Snorri Sturluson wrote them down around the turn of the 12th century. Old English poems like Beowulf, Dale and The Wanderer also have little markers that we can look at which are evidence that these poems were transmitted orally for generations before some priest or some monk wrote them down. Now, religion as the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons would have understood it is not the way that we would view it today. It is entwined within their worldview. Their worldview is shaped by their tribe, by their family, by their political allegiances. And it is probably for this reason that we see ancestor deification in numerous Germanic societies. It is why, for these reasons, that we see certain settlements in England worship one god rather than the other. For example, some places will favour the worship of Woden over the worship of Thunor, over the worship of Tu. It is the intricacies of all of these factors that combine to give us our understanding of paganism. Indeed, it is difficult to define paganism, as it is predominantly a definition created by Christians in order to define individuals as the other. That being said, the term pagan is relatively useful when we come to refer to these pre-Christian societies, so it is the term that I am going to use for the remainder of this video. So then, without further ado, let's take a look at what Anglo-Saxon paganism actually was, starting with a few of the main deities. Now, according to the writings of the Venerable Bede, an Anglo-Saxon historian and monk, the tribes of the Angles, Jutes and Saxons landed in Great Britain in the year 447 AD. Now, these three tribes were already pagan when they came to the shores of Great Britain, and they would have worshipped similar deities to the rest of the wider Germanic world. Once the mission of St. Augustine arrived in 597 AD, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom slowly began to convert to Christianity, culminating in the Kingdom of Mercia during the late 7th century. Now, it is upon the Kingdom of Mercia that I would first like to direct our focus, and it's not just because I come from the ancient capital of Mercia, no. This kingdom held out against the encroachment of Christianity for the longest time. And because of this, we can see evidence of pagan worship much later than the other English kingdoms. For instance, around the modern day city Birmingham, you have the town Wednesbury, which translated into Old English is Woden's Borough. And you also have the town Wensfield, which again translated into Old English means Woden's Field. These two place names are examples of late period Anglo-Saxon Woden worship taking place in the heart of the British Midlands. Now, Woden, of course, is the highest god in the Anglo-Saxon pantheon. His name means the Furious One. He is the personification of divine madness. He is the Wanderer. He is the god of death and the dead. He is the psychopomp who guides the living souls into the next world. In Anglo-Saxon iconography, we see him depicted as a spear-wielding, bird-helmeted man. His associations with carrion birds such as ravens and eagles point to him being a god of the dead, and he is listed as the progenitor of the royal genealogies in the Exeter Book. However, he is not the only god that the Anglo-Saxons had. Now, also in Mercia, there is evidence for the worship of the god Tu, who is the Anglo-Saxon cognate to the Norse god Tyr. If we look at place names such as Tysmere, Tysley and Tyslow, these names are all associated with the god Tyr, which leads us to believe that certain areas of the country preferred worship of one god to another. For instance, the town of Wednesbury and Tysley are about 16 miles apart, either side of the city of Birmingham, yet they still worship two different gods, that being Woden and Tu. Now, the name Tu stems from Tiwaz, which was the Proto-Germanic word for god or celestial being. Now, Tu is seen as the god of heroic battle and of glory, as opposed to the more existential nature of Woden's warfare. Tu is the god of the thing. Tu is the god of civilization and the tribe. He represents the Innengard, the inner circle, the tribe itself, the people, and defends them against the forces of chaos, those forces from outside the tribe that may wish to do them harm. We see this in the later Norse myth of Tyr and Fenrir, where Tyr places his hand into the wolf's jaw as a symbol of goodwill to assure Fenrir that there is going to be no trickery. Fenrir, of course, bites off his arm, and Tyr's sacrifice for the good of his tribe, the Aesir, is shown. Tu is a representative of a more grounded communal authority. If we want to look at iconography related to Tyr, some scholars say that the figure on the Sutton Hoo purse, the large figure flanked by two wolves, is representative of the god Tu himself. And if we look at the Tyr rune, which is also associated with him, we find it on many urns and swords. Tu is one of three primary deities we see in the toponomic evidence from the UK, the others being Woden and, of course, Thunor. As a warrior god, Tu was probably venerated by the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon warrior classes, who may have prayed to him for victory in battle or success in a legal case. As a god of justice, Tu would have represented the higher authority in the Thing, which was kind of like a pre-Christian parliament, where people from the tribe would come and air their discussions and settle legal disputes. Now, moving on to our final primary deity, we of course cannot talk about the pagan religion of Northern Europe without talking about the thunder god. Called Thor in Norse mythology, in the Anglo-Saxon tongue he was called Thunor, which is the Old English word for thunder. It would appear that Thunor was a more prominent god in the Kingdom of Wessex, where places such as Thundersley, Thunderslayer and Thundersfield are all associated with the god Thunor. Now, it's interesting that these places appear primarily in Saxon and Jutish areas and are typically associated with what's called a lair, which is a grove or a meadow. We also find evidence for the worship of Thunor through protective talismans, particularly the long-handled hammer ones that we find in Kent. These are similar, of course, to the later Mjolnir pendants that we find in Norway, Denmark and some parts of England. The Fjellfot symbol was also associated with the god Thunor and is found on many ceremonial and burial urns, which show his pervasive influence to Anglo-Saxon society. Now, Thunor's role was as a kind of cosmic protector, and this is reinforced through the later Norse myths of Thor battling Jormungandr and destroying Jotuns left, right and centre. Thunor is the god of the common folk, and he represents them at the Thing. Whereas Tyr represents the higher authority, Thunor is the will of the people, and he manifests the will of the people. So why did the common people worship Thunor? Well, as the Thunderer, he is the one that brings down the rains, which is obviously important for the growing of crops. He would therefore be associated with fertility and with the harvest. Later associations with Thor as the protector of sailors and boatsmen would also echo with the common people. Now, these three gods are just the most attested ones in Anglo-Saxon paganism, and obviously they are cognate to the Norse Odin, Tyr and Thor. However, we have only just begun to scratch the surface of the number of deities, semi-divine beings and spirits that the Anglo-Saxons both believed in and at certain points would have worshipped. We're not going to try and cover all of the Anglo-Saxon gods in this video because that would take forever, and quite frankly, we don't have the time. So in the future we are likely going to do a series of videos just on each of the individual Anglo-Saxon gods, give you a little bit of iconography, give you some examples of them in literature, and maybe a few places named after them. Now, this brings us on nicely to our final section of the video. How exactly was it that the Anglo-Saxons worshipped these gods? Now, this section is going to include a little bit of hypothesizing. Obviously, we cannot say exactly how the Anglo-Saxons would have worshipped, that is impossible. However, we can make an educated guess. I feel like I should preface all of these videos by saying, when it comes to this time period, we just aren't sure. We have theories, but we cannot say anything for certain. So, to assess pagan temples, we are first going to take a look at the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Yevering, in what would have been the ancient kingdom of Bernicia. Now, Yevering was a relatively small settlement, but it held a very important discovery. Archaeologists found in a building they called D2 what they thought were the remains of a pagan temple or a pagan shrine. Now, they believed it was a pagan temple or shrine because there were no signs of human habitation in the buildings. Now, when we say human habitation, we mean little telltale signs in the archaeology that point to the fact that a human being once lived there. That could be the remains of a fire pit, gnawed bones, could be the rushes on the floor, could be space for a bed, so on and so forth. But this building at Yevering had no signs of any human habitation, and it was a relatively large building. So why would the Anglo-Saxons build such a large building if they weren't going to live in it, or if they weren't going to use it for some reason? Now, this brings us on to a large pit that archaeologists found in the centre of D2 in Yevering. Now, this pit in the centre of the building was filled with the skulls of oxen, which were all presumably sacrificed ritually. Also in the building at Yevering there were 3 holes in the ground, which archaeologists believed would have contained icons or totems to the gods. Now, whilst we don't have much archaeological evidence in England for the remains of god posts, we do have a lot of evidence from both Celtic and Norse sources. Now, the god posts would have been wooden depictions of the gods that they worshipped at Yevering. Now, although this temple in the archaeological source is the only one found in England so far, they are well attested in the written sources of the time. In Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, he writes that King Redwald of East Anglia kept a temple in which were the shrines dedicated to the old gods. Now, there was also a letter sent by Pope Gregory to Abbot Mellitus in 601 AD. This letter comes a few years after St. Augustine's mission to convert the English people. In this letter, Pope Gregory says that under no circumstances should you destroy the English temples. Instead, you should go into the temples, destroy the profane icons, and replace them with altar and sprinkle a little bit of holy water about, just to make it all nice and Christian. So it could be that the earliest Anglo-Saxon churches originally started their life as pagan temples. Why did Pope Gregory ask for this? Well, we already know that the Christian Church has a long history of taking indigenous festivals and indigenous dates and just incorporating them into the Christian faith in efforts to aid conversion. It could very well be the case that they did the same thing with pagan temples in England, maybe to give the Anglo-Saxons a sense of continuity with the past. However, we don't know how effective Pope Gregory's letter was because in his ecclesiastical history, Bede also writes that King Earconbert of Kent went around destroying loads of pagan temples and loads of pagan icons. So, did they transform them into Christian churches, or did they just burn them down? Probably a little bit of both. Bede also states that at one point, hoping for protection against the plague, the people rebuilt their pagan temples and re-established the old idols. So, maybe temples existed. However, in Tacitus's Germania, he states that the Germanic people are loath to imprison their gods within four walls. He states that the Germanic people do not deem it consistent with the divine majesty to imprison their gods within four walls, and instead prefer to worship at open sites out in nature. Now obviously Tacitus was writing in the 1st century AD, so things may have changed in the couple of hundred years between then and the Anglo-Saxon migration to Britain. However, they still come from the same Germanic group of people, so it may very well be the case that Anglo-Saxons worship both in temples and at sites out in nature. Now, to trace the existence of natural sites of worship in Anglo-Saxon England, we need to look for the word heag in place names. This is a cognate to the Old Norse word hogur, which means something akin to a stone altar upon a high place. Now, the fact that we find the word heag combined a lot with the words hill and dún, both of which mean hill or hill, means that Anglo-Saxons probably also had outside worship places. And when we look at the locations of these kinds of sites, we often find that they are quite a distance from ancient roads. So these sacred spaces are out in nature, they are away from civilization, which again reflects the idea that the Germanic people don't want to contain their gods within four walls all the time. These sacred spaces may have been waterfalls, they may have been caves or cliffs, or just high peaks in the environment. Because we see Thunor's name associated with lairs, groves or meadows, it may be that certain rituals associated with these gods took place in open natural spaces. It could be that these sacred spaces were places where people might go on a pilgrimage, and I'm aware that that is a very Christian word that I'm using, but they might go on a pilgrimage to in order to obtain the blessing of a god or of a certain nature spirit. Now, I'm aware this was a very quick whistle-stop tour of Anglo-Saxon paganism, but I hope that I provided what I intended to, and to just have given you a general overview of what the Anglo-Saxons believed in and how they worshipped. Obviously, as I said, this is the first video in a new series that we are starting here on the channel, and we're very much looking forward to, well, making a load of videos about something that's very close to our heart. We love Anglo-Saxon history, we love Anglo-Saxon paganism especially, so whatever we can provide to you, we will try our very best. So are there any particular gods that you want to know about? Obviously, we're going to do proper videos on Woden, Tu and Thunor, but there are a wealth of other gods that we're going to cover. We also need to take a look at the Anglo-Saxon belief in the spirit world, and of little elves that run around causing trouble all the time. So if you enjoyed this video, please do feel free to give us a like, give us a subscribe, and leave a comment. It really does help us out, and we appreciate it massively. Now, as ever folks, it has come to the end of our time together. I want to thank you all very much for watching and for the amazing support that you've given the channel so far. We only ever hope to improve, so any of your comments, whether they be constructive or just plain mean, are much appreciated. You have been watching The Fyrdsman, I've been your host Connor, and once again, goodbye.